Hey friends, there's a common belief that the goal of life is to maximize pleasure, minimize pain. I'm going to show you some research which basically disproves that, at least if you want a flourishing life. It's fascinating stuff. For example, you may have heard of the parent who wants to eliminate all adversity for their child. Or maybe you are a parent or you were that child. You may have also heard of safe spaces on campus where administrators try to minimize all pain and all distress and all adversity for students so they can somehow study more. Or you may have heard of utilitarianism in philosophy, which is an ethical theory that says pain is inherently bad, pleasure is inherently good, and the goal of life is to minimize all suffering for all sentient beings, something like that. These are very widespread and influential views, and I think they're all wrong. And here's why. So in this video, I'm going to show you some really cool research that might change your life. And not only that, I think by the end, you're going to see that these are actually very unwise ways of looking at the world and why they actually inhibit well-being. Not only are they not good, they're actively harmful to people. And my goal is for you to think more deeply about what pain and adversity could mean in your life, because I want you to flourish. So as a reminder, I'm Dr. Omar. I'm a philosopher and social scientist, and I try to get at the heart of a lot of these questions with heterodox or unique ways of thinking about things in hopefully empirically and logically rigorous ways. As I mentioned, the common view, adversity and pain are inherently bad. A good life means you maximize pleasure and you minimize pain. Imagine yourself on the beach, sipping a drink, or even going through difficult things like school, but everything being really pleasant and calm. And then adversity is something to be minimized, and comfort and ease is to be maximized. Even in a relationship, you might think the goal is to just have total harmony. Here's one of the main studies that I want to go over with you. It's called Whatever Does Not Kill Us: Cumulative Lifetime Adversity, Vulnerability, and Resilience. So what they asked in this study was, what is the relationship between cumulative lifetime adversity, meaning when you look over your life and you look at all the negative, difficult, painful things that have happened to you, and you add all of those up and you put them under one metric and you call it adversity, how does that amount compare to the person's well-being? And well-being can be unpacked in many different ways. For example, how much psychopathology does a person have? How much mental illness do they have? How much PTSD, trauma? What's their life satisfaction? There's many ways of defining well-being, but is there any relationship between those two things? Just step back and imagine what you would expect that relationship to look like. The more adversity you have less well-being. The more adversity, you have more well-being. What's that going to look like? Think about that for a second. And what was cool is they followed people for a long time across many years, and this is a national sample, so it's a fairly well-selected population and a good method. And they divided it up into moderate, low, and high. Moderate adversity, low adversity, and high adversity. And here's the main finding. People who had moderate amounts of adversity, meaning they didn't have low adversity, they didn't have high adversity, moderate amounts of adversity, had the least amount of global distress. They had the least amount of functional impairment, not being able to function in their activities of daily living. And they had the least amount of post-traumatic stress symptoms. So it wasn't the people who had the lowest adversity who did the best. It was the people who had some adversity, but not too much. And the moderate adversity group also had the highest life satisfaction. When you look at your life overall, how satisfied are you with how your life is going or how your life has gone? It wasn't the people with the lowest adversity. And then also when you ask people, how affected were you by adverse events recently? The people with a moderate adversity were the least affected by recent adverse events. So they were actually the most stable, the most calm. That's really interesting. And here's a graphical representation of this. So on the x-axis here from left to right, you can see how much adversity the person had, 0, a moderate amount or a high amount. And on the y-axis, it shows how much of the well-being or adversity effect there was. So they measured this in terms of 4 different variables: PTSD symptoms, which is the little triangles, the life satisfaction score, which is the X function drawing here, and then functional impairment's a little circle, and then global distress is the square here. So just looking at where this line here is highest, so this is life satisfaction, it's highest in the middle. So the people with moderate amounts of adversity had the highest life satisfaction, and then they had the lowest amounts of all these other things: lowest global distress, lowest functional impairment, lowest PTSD symptoms. So you have a kind of U-shaped curve. It's not linear, it's U-shaped. So in summary, the worst off people are the most sheltered people who have low adversity in this study. For example, wealthy people who are miserable really are suffering. They shouldn't be dismissed. Oftentimes you hear people say, oh, those are the worried, like the Woody Allen type people, or the people who are wealthy or lucky in life. Maybe they have a lot of money, or maybe they have a really comfortable environment. But what's interesting is that when they don't have any adversity, they actually suffer quite a bit. And their subjective suffering is a lot more than somebody who had more adversity. So, what I take from this is that, hey, suffering is suffering, and people who are too sheltered have a risk factor to suffer. So, if you were a parent, that means you probably don't want your children to be too sheltered. So, I think this has implications for parenting styles. It also has implications for educational policy, not sheltering students from things that make them uncomfortable. And also thinking about one's own life, I would wish myself to have some adversity and not no adversity or very little adversity if I had any say in it, which of course I don't most of the time. But also, what we can learn from this is that severely traumatized people who are extremely overwhelmed, people who've lived through war, genocide, rape, torture, natural disaster, those kinds of people are also the worst off. Their distress is very high, their functional impairment is very low. And even though they have been through these things, it's expected that they're going to have high scores on these things. So that's probably not so surprising. But what is surprising is that their levels of distress are almost indistinguishable from people who are very sheltered and had low adversity. So this Goldilocks zone of adversity is in the moderate level for being best off. Moderately challenging somebody makes them more resilient. But if you overwhelm them, they're going to be dysfunctional. They're going to have psychopathology symptoms go higher. So I think this also has some lessons for how to think about your own personal development. You want to challenge yourself in a way that's making your life not too easy and also not so overwhelming. And when you think on this, it might seem like common sense. Yeah, obviously, but I think it's not common sense that if you shelter somebody, they're going to actually suffer more. That, I think, is an amazing finding we see here from this study. So some other lessons, I think avoiding pain makes people less happy and more fragile. You might think the goal of life should be to always avoid pain and go after pleasure. It doesn't work. Avoiding pain makes you worse off. You want to have some amount of pain because pain is a signal that has been designed in your body to give you feedback about the world. People who don't have any pain receptors in their body will die at a younger age. That won't be as functional. You could think of it in the very crass materialistic sense of your pain receptors. You can also think of it in the existential sense, as C.S. Lewis says, suffering is God's megaphone. Suffering is a way to wake us up to something and to try to help us reorient ourselves. And I think when you think about pain in that way, it changes your experience of pain. It helps you think of pain and suffering as something that you can transform and that's something that you can move through, as opposed to being something that you have to totally avoid. And that's always bad. And I think this gives the lie to utilitarian philosophies, which are very simplistic. They function only at the level of the midbrain. They don't go beyond dopamine. And I think they're just obviously made up philosophies from the 1700s, which are silly. They don't really make sense. It's a nice theory, but it's the wrong species. It does not for our species. And also is logically incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. When you actually examine it in detail, it leads to absurd conclusions, repugnant conclusions, and silly conclusions. The fact that making yourself more fragile is bad is really relevant when you're in school. It's also really relevant when you're in a relationship, because if you run away from all suffering in a relationship and all pain in a relationship, the relationship is not going to go as well. You need to think of your relationship as a process of sanctification, a process of moral development, and a process of growth, so that you need feedback, and pain is feedback as well as pleasure. And in the same way, pleasure is not always good. Often it's not good. Pain is not always bad. Sometimes it is. So a better metaphor for flourishing is training in the gym. You want to feel some pain when your muscles are overwhelmed because that's a sign of growth. You don't want to feel too much pain because you might be doing the exercise in the wrong way. But if you don't feel any pain, then you actually have not challenged yourself. You're not pushing yourself. You're not getting better at that task. You're not getting better at that goal, whether it's pull-ups or complex movements or gymnastics or whatever you're doing. Life is much more like a gym and much less like a hedonic metric or a kindergarten where anytime you cry, it's always, let's make it go away. It's not even true for babies, for God's sake. We need to build coping muscles. We need to build strengths. and we need to build on feedback from the world. And of course, too much, we're going to be crushed, but a moderate amount is going to strengthen resilience. And the goal of life is really to learn and grow as a person, morally, spiritually, and we need to build resilience. We need to endure through life. If you can't endure through life, it's not going to go well. You're not going to flourish. And as I mentioned, there's other relevant lessons, I think, for therapy, psychotherapy, education, parenting. The goal is to help the person face difficulty and move through difficulty and learn and grow with difficulty, not to avoid difficulty, not to avoid feeling uncomfortable, not to avoid feeling unsafe, because that's not the world. The world isn't like that. So if you're simulating that for your child, for your student, for your client, you're only helping them a certain amount, and you may actually be causing more harm than good. We can always make somebody feel supported even when they're feeling challenged. Support is different from avoiding difficulty, from avoiding pain and suffering, running away from unsafety. And that balance is really what matters. And that's probably what moderate adversity provides. And if you look at what a really good therapist does, for example, when somebody's facing a phobia, is they turn towards the pain. They don't get thrown into the pain, they turn towards the pain. And then that pain loses its grip on the person. And that can be true of various kinds of pain. But avoiding and turning away from the pain actually will increase the power of that pain and suffering over the person. So a good therapist will help somebody feel supported, but also not feel comfortable all the time. And a lot of therapy is like good parenting. And wise grandparents and parents know this as well. And in terms of well-being, as I mentioned, well-being is not the absence of adversity or pain. It's the transformation of suffering into purpose, into meaning, into connection, into growth, and into wisdom. Life is full of suffering, so we can't avoid suffering and pain. That's the basic presumption of many spiritual traditions. Life is suffering. In this life, you will have trouble. Christ says, the Buddha's first noble truth is that suffering is unavoidable. So if you go through life trying to avoid suffering, you're going to suffer more. If you go through life expecting suffering, you're going to suffer less because you're not going to be as destroyed by suffering. And number two, if you see the purpose of life as transforming suffering into something meaningful, into something purposeful with wisdom and growth and connection, then any kind of suffering in your life is going to look more like a gym. It's going to look more like a bench press or a yoga mat as opposed to a storm cloud or a knife coming at you. So think of that transformation piece. That's really key. Working through suffering. And if you look at people who have wisdom, oftentimes they look back on the most difficult and most traumatic suffering that they've had, and they say that they've learned the most from it. And it was often the most transformative experience of their life in terms of meaning and purpose. Not that they would ask for it again, or not that they would ever have willed it ahead of time, but that life is not that simple, that it's about pleasure and pain. If you found this helpful, please share it with someone you love. Feel free to join my free newsletter, The Pursuit of Truth, or check out this other video. Thanks so much.